Britain caused some of the biggest modern intelligence failures for the Americans. Traitors like Kim Philby, who betrayed the major US operations against the Soviets, or the atomic spies such as Klaus Fuchs. Every time the United States was forced to deal with the consequences, and there was never a fundamental change of the way Britain handled intelligence. Before World War I, the British decided to form an alliance with Russia and France to demolish the Germans and Austrians. A decision which ultimately required American assistance and paved the way for the Communist Revolution. A lesser-known disaster was the British deception operation against the Nazis, which seemed like simple appeasement and passiveness in public, but behind the scenes, the aristocrats feigned great sympathies for the Hitler cult. As the researchers Lou Kilzer and Carol Quigley demonstrated, this charade was intended to make the Nazis look to the east and ultimately clash with the Russians. But the right choice would have been to be blunt early towards the Germans when the Nazi war machine was in its infant stages. Again, things spiraled out of control, and the United States had to move in and save the world. Kim Philby, the traitor, was exonerated in Britain even when the Americans had already exposed what he was. After his escape to the Soviet Union, there was speculation by the expert Ben McIntyre that the British MI6 had simply refused to make an arrest. It took until 2020 to see some files released to the British National Archives, which contained the lame excuse that the government had intended to avoid public embarrassment. But did Philby's treason lead to a shake-up and renewal of British intelligence in the 1960s? No. Newer books such as Trinity re-examine the strange series of supposed blunders of British intelligence when it came to vetting the atomic scientist Klaus Fuchs, a German communist who had fled the Nazis and joined the Tube Alloys project in Britain. The United States was promised he was trustworthy enough to work on the Manhattan Project. But the repeated failures by the British on a fundamental level suggest to researchers there must have been a highly placed mole who protected Mr. Fuchs for as long as possible. Did the epic failure fundamentally change British intelligence? No. The fairly new book, called The Secret Royals, bluntly states that British spies are crown servants and that Queen Elizabeth had unrestricted access to all intelligence and was theoretically able to share information with her relatives. That also included the secrets which the United States was trusting Britain with. It has never been properly researched how the British had infiltrated America after the revolution with assets posing as migrants and merchants and scientists and so on. The royal family that is seen on television is a tiny little fraction of a very old and staggeringly large cluster of 3 aristocratic lines. They're called Welfen, Wettiner, and Reginare. Their sublineages, such as Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein, held the Russian Tsarist throne in the past. If these family networks were seriously compromised by communist Russia, this problem would extend to the older British spy networks that had been established in the United States. Ever since the Red October Revolution in Russia, the American intelligence community has been baffled by the successes of the communist espionage. Things were so bad that the CIA and the FBI were desperately searching for moles in their own leadership and even beyond that. The KGB always relied on very basic techniques, yet their successes seemed almost supernatural. Was their secret recipe the failure of British aristocratic intelligence? Louis Mountbatten, the infamous uncle of Prince Philip, who was the husband of Queen Elizabeth, was considered a sympathizer of Marxism and came under suspicion of being compromised by the Soviets due to his sexual deviances. Researchers to this day try to reconstruct whether he was linked to the Kinkora Boys' Home scandal and traitors like Anthony Blunt. Andrew Loney tried in vain to gain access to Mountbatten's written correspondences. Queen Elizabeth's cousin, Prince Michael of Kent, told undercover reporters in a virtual meeting that he could be hired to establish confidential links with Putin's Russian regime. Journalists from Channel 4 Dispatches and the Sunday Times claim that Prince Michael and the Marquess of Reading were leasing or selling their connections to the Russian regime. If the aristocrats had fully admitted to their staggering blunders in the past, they would have been finished. They always preferred to cover things up in the hopes of securing their own survival. The biggest secret still to be uncovered is their role before, during, and after the Communist Revolution. So, British spies or crown servants. The first head of MI6, Mansfield Cumming, considered himself to be in the service of the king, not the prime minister. King George VI knew all the secrets during World War II, from the D-Day plans to the code breakers at Bletchley Park. MI6 chief Stuart Minges was the stepson of the king's equerry and perhaps the illegitimate child of a king. Queen Elizabeth selected a former MI5 chief, Mr. Andrew Parker, to be Lord Chamberlain in the royal household in 2021. Special Branch was once created because of assassination attempts against Queen Victoria. In 1950, King George VI shared secret documents with Princess Elizabeth, who was only 23 years old at the time. Prime Minister Clement Attlee provided her with detailed notes from the cabinet classified as top secret. She also received State Department documents. Her private secretary was Baron Martin Charteris, member of the Privy Council and decorated with the most elite medals. His grandfather had already been a deputy lieutenant of the crown. Martin served in military intelligence and worked closely with Maurice Oldfield, later head of MI6. In October 2012, the BBC current affairs program Panorama reported that he had been linked by Operation Midland and a Metropolitan Police informant to the Elm Guesthouse child abuse scandal, which allegedly involved senior MPs and security staff. The investigation ended without charges, and in 2017, Mr. Oldfield was acquitted of all allegations of child abuse at the Elm Guesthouse and elsewhere. Princess Elizabeth grew up with her cousin Margaret Rhodes, who worked for MI6. The royal family communicated with the political government via new encrypted telephones. Elizabeth was given the code name 2519. She fell in love with Prince Philip of the House of Mountbatten. That's actually the House of Hessen or Hessen-Darmstadt. His infamous uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, was Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. Although Philip came from the usual family circles, there was a PR problem at the time. All three of his sisters had married German princes during the Nazi era. Elizabeth became significantly involved in Cold War matters. Every evening at 7 o'clock, she received a red leather-clad box containing top-secret diplomatic cables, cabinet meeting notes, and intelligence memos. The Queen also always received the first copy of the weekly summary from the Secret Services. Even in the event of war, she would have been able to access all information, no matter how secret, on the condition that the documents were burned after reading them. She was considered to be very neat and tidy in her handling of documents and returned all government papers that were not destroyed. Who else from her family she shared the information with is, of course, a secret. In the mornings, there were additional meetings at Buckingham Palace with diplomats, intelligence chiefs, high-ranking politicians, and military officers. Tuesday afternoons were reserved for secret meetings with the prime ministers. Queen Elizabeth's second son, Andrew, Duke of York, later had a most embarrassing scandal with a young lady procured by Jeffrey Epstein. The royal family knew that Anthony Blunt was a KGB spy as early as 1948. Elizabeth was ahead of her own prime minister, Alec Douglas Home, on that matter. Blunt was turned, meaning he had to work against the Soviets in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Philip's uncle, Louis Mountbatten, became chairman of the armed forces and was given access to all of America's nuclear weapons secrets. After visiting Aunt Olga in Toronto, sister of Russian Tsar Nicholas II, he met with the head of the Strategic Air Command. Britain's Blue Streak missile program was plagued by technical problems, so they turned to the American Skybolt missiles. In 1995, Elizabeth and Philip visited the headquarters of GCHQ in Cheltenham, responsible for electronic espionage. The Queen received briefings from GCHQ, which grew out of naval intelligence, and her relatives from the aristocratic line of Hessen traditionally made up the Lords of the Admiralty, meaning the leadership of the Navy. The access to secret intelligence made it possible, theoretically, to use classified materials to further the wealth and power of the larger cluster of aristocratic families. After the end of the Soviet Union, the royals played a crucial role in the new relations with Russia and Eastern Europe. In principle, the KGB was allowed to move assets to the City of London and various associated tax havens. Brian Fall, the British ambassador to Moscow, orchestrated royal visits to signal support for Yeltsin. Francis Richards from the embassy, who later became head of GCHQ, was able to move around everywhere in St. Petersburg and met with the mayor, a certain Vladimir Putin. The author and researcher Catherine Belton says that her source confirmed a visit by a very young Putin to a Russian-born princess in Hessen-Darmstadt. So, it is clear that the British royal family, in theory, could cause the biggest possible damage if they had traitors in their midst who shared intelligence. Soviet Russia. But the true size of the family and how far it reaches back turns this issue into the biggest possible intelligence nightmare in history. The average person assumes the extended royal family has maybe 100 members or maybe a few hundred. Pompous buffoons who lost control a long time ago, just like the Russian czars or the French kings or the Austrian Habsburgs and so on. Let me introduce you to the largest family cluster you have never met or you may have never recognized. There are three main lines named Welfen, Wettine, and Reginare. You have probably never heard these names in your life, and that is exactly how they wanted it to be from a certain point in time onwards. Those three lines contain sublineages with names that should be a lot more familiar because they also describe the places in Germany which they controlled. Hessen, Schleswig-Holstein, Mecklenburg, Sachsen, Hanover, Braunschweig, etc. For the longest time, Germany was not a unified empire, but simply a patchwork of different mini-kingdoms, principalities, and countdoms. Some were allies, some were enemies. New studies suggest that even in the Roman Empire, the intelligence sphere was far greater than previously known, and intelligence drove every important decision. Previously, historians noted the lack of grand, formal, and bureaucratic agencies. But the Romans had specific reasons to avoid such agencies at the time. Intelligence was in the hands of the aristocracy, and they could use anything and everything as a vehicle for networks and operations. This style of intelligence was inherited by various European empires. The Welfen are traced back to the year 800, while they themselves see their origins in the troubled times after the fall of Rome. Just like the Wettine and Reginare, they use the advantage of size and loyalty. They usually try to have up to 10 or more legitimate children, and often there were up to 50 illegitimate offspring with mothers from these aristocratic circles. If someone did not inherit an official title in the official name, they could still be valuable assets under a normal name. While Rome was plagued by competing aristocratic factions and the assassination of a specific emperor could have significant consequences, the Welfen Wettiner and Reginare always had a large pool of people to replace someone immediately. And they certainly had enough personnel, money, and protected locations to form their own large-scale intelligence service. By controlling universities, they had access to the science necessary to build corporations and so on, especially corporations in America at some point. Their main enemy was the French monarchy, which dominated the Catholic Vatican. In 1714, the Welfen king George I, who was originally from Hanover, ascended to the British throne and kept a low profile in public. His family network was supposed to flood Britain and run as much as possible in politics and business from the shadows. You could call that a cryptocracy. Only 3 years later, British Freemasonry was founded, and its sister organization was the Royal Society for Science. The goal was to have a controlled version of the Enlightenment. Modern science was the first opportunity in thousands of years of imperial history to improve the ancient system and turn it into a cryptocracy. Before, the people knew exactly who wielded the power, but the people were not allowed to complain. In the future, people would be allowed to complain, but they would no longer know who truly wielded the ultimate power. More people were put in schools, universities, and factories to create more wealth and vital technology for Britain. French and Catholic networks tried to no avail to overthrow the Welfen kings and make Britain a Catholic nation again. As we all know, Britain lost the American Revolutionary War, but the British were determined to win the intelligence war in the shadows. The American colonies were dwarfed by the French one, and when the revolution happened, the British decided to cease military action and use clandestine methods instead. Brute forcing the issue would have led to an increased permanent threat in America, a threat by the French, especially. By officially accepting U.S. independence, the pressure was greatly reduced. A few decades later, even Napoleon didn't see the United States as a threat and ultimately sold Louisiana. The 13 colonies had contained British clandestine networks, and later a steady flow of migrants from Europe flooded the United States. Not just British migrants were potentially intelligence assets, but also those who came from German territories of the Welfen, Wettiner, and Reginare. If the British aristocracy was infiltrated by communist Russia, this would have given Moscow access to the old spy networks in the United States. So this is perhaps the big secret, the secret recipe, the secret sauce, the reason why the KGB was so successful. In France, various circles calculated that the monarchy was outdated and favored a constitutional monarchy. British intelligence followed a dual strategy: partially support the revolutionaries and partially support the adherents of the old order. One of the front groups that had operated in Bavaria was the Order of the Illuminati. The key members were princes from the circles of Welfen, Wettiner, and Reginare. Several blunders led to raids and arrests by the Bavarian police. Membership lists and internal documents ended up in newspapers, books, and pamphlets. The British feared that more front organizations and networks could be exposed, and therefore they created modern conspiracy literature. The Austrian researcher Klaus Oberhauser published a study which initially focused on the British agent Alexander Horn, who was rumored to have supplied material for the best-selling book Proofs of a Conspiracy by John Robison, a leader of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. During his research, Oberhauser stumbled upon a much greater operation which also included Augustin Baruel and August von Stark, legendary conspiracy authors. These conspiracy books carefully avoided any leads that might connect the Illuminati to Britain and aristocratic intelligence. Instead, they told the story of weird Masonic lodges pursuing the French Revolution as a revolt against God and traditional order. The most powerful Illuminati members were painted as naive and well-meaning. Especially Baruel called for the reinstallment of the French monarchy in his conspiracy book series. The British had established the modern fractional banking system and bond market. To prevent competing empires from copying the system, British intelligence badmouthed these modern capitalist tools in various books and pamphlets aimed at the French, German, and Austrian audiences for the most part. This propaganda was framed as socialist, extreme right-wing, and as conspiracy material. Thomas Duncombe spread the Rothschild mythology in the British Parliament as early as 1828. The French early socialists created the modern myth of the Jewish world conspiracy. When the left dropped the anti-Semitism, but kept the hatred against trade and private ownership intact, the German and Austrian extreme right wing picked it up in a big way. Now, the first meaningful Rothschild had been recruited by the Landgraf of Hessen-Kassel. British intelligence kept using him and his sons, while at the same time the intelligence services pumped out anti-Jewish conspiracy literature. In the 1800s, empires had to industrialize while still maintaining control of the population. Socialist ideas had gained traction in previous generations when roughly 90% of the population were serfs, mostly farmers with only rudimentary legal protection. The agenda of toppling the aristocrats, ending the influence of the church, redistributing the land and the assets, and then making private ownership illegal was of course met with blunt force and espionage in Europe and Russia. A communist terrorist or simply an activist did not have any meaningful legal protection against searches and seizures, torture and pressure against family members. This made it relatively easy for the secret police to infiltrate the leftist movement. In German Prussia, for example, the ruling aristocracy intended to control social democrats and slowly improve the working conditions and wages without risking insurgencies. France was hoping to placate the workers and farmers as well. Britain thought socialism was a tool to destabilize France and Germany. And that is how they got themselves into this dangerous game. It was a much bigger risk than running operations under the cover of the far less radical Enlightenment ideas. Germany was still saturated with old aristocratic networks of Welfen, Wettiner, and Reginare. Needless to say, front groups like the Bavarian Order of the Illuminati had an Enlightenment facade. The so-called League of Communists tried to push for revolution through actions and publications, including participation in civil war-like struggles in various failed uprising attempts. On the European mainland, turmoil was raging everywhere, but there was relative calm in Britain. A man named Wolfgang Waldner published a rare but unfortunately left-wing study with the title The Prussian Government Agent Karl Marx, which contains many illustrative quotes. The core thesis is that Marx assumed the leadership position in the socialist movement on behalf of his aristocratic in-laws from Prussia in order to spy on socialists and to drive the movement in a direction that was useful to the Prussian nobility. Marx seemed to be the suitable candidate. Aggressive, narcissistic, but engaging when necessary, cunning but not too smart, ambitious, but without any real enduring work ethic. Thanks to his father's connections, Marx married Jenny von Westphalen. Her ancestors included high-ranking officials from Prussia who, for example, headed the Ministry of the Interior and were therefore responsible for espionage against revolutionary groups. In 1751, Philipp von Westphalen became secretary to the Prussian Lieutenant General and Freemason Ferdinand von Braunschweig, the brother-in-law of the Prussian king, and Freemason Friedrich II. Ferdinand was also a member of the Illuminati order, which also included people like the Landgraf Karl von Hessen-Kassel. The Hessen-Kassel family was extremely closely related to the British and Russian thrones. Ferdinand von Braunschweig was in command of the allied troops of England, Hanover, and Prussia. Philipp von Westphalen also took on an important military function, and the British King George III from the House of Hanover gave him a title. Philip married a noblewoman with Scottish ancestry. His son was Ludwig von Westphalen. His son, Ferdinand, in turn became Prussian interior minister, was therefore responsible for espionage against revolutionary groups. Ludwig's daughter, Jenny, eventually married Karl Marx. And the Marx-friendly historians tried to make it seem as if there were tensions between Jenny and her family, even though the facts show normal family relationships. Of all people, Ludwig von Westphalen suggested Saint-Simon's ideas of socialism to Marx, and Marx later dedicated his doctoral thesis to Ludwig. Had Ludwig really set the young Marx on the path to socialism? My guess, however, is that he recruited Marx as an informant. Marx and Edgar von Westphalen, Jenny's brother, already knew each other at the high school in Trier, and there is evidence that students back then spied on the teachers and reported suspicious left-wing revolutionary or other tendencies. Marx was a destroyer. He infiltrated organizations, caused unnecessary arguments, chaos, and legalese problematic provocations, and somehow always got away with it unscathed. Some comrades accused Marx of preaching eternal waiting for revolution and salvation. Others accused him of initiating provocations at the wrong time and thus causing problems for socialist groups. Marx begged his friends like Engels for money, and Engels established contact with Robert Owen, a British entrepreneur and early socialist who is considered the founder of the cooperative system. A certain factory became a model company that was also visited by princes, politicians, Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, and Austrian princes. Mr. Owen even gave speeches to the United States Congress. In 1854, Marx befriended David Urquhart, a British aristocrat who believed Lord Palmerston to be a Russian spy, interestingly enough. Several British politicians were likely agents of the Tsar, who was part of the family cluster of Welfen, Wettin, and Reginare. In public, the British and Russian thrones kept their distance. Marx and Engels took over the League of the Righteous and turned it into the League of Communists, from which the Socialist International eventually grew. Marx completed his Communist Manifesto and the Capital. Marx took control of the so-called First International. He died in London on March 14th, 1883 at the age of 64 years old. Royal Society members attended the funeral. Lenin's brother had translated texts by Marx and was involved in a plot to assassinate the Tsar. Lenin himself referred to Marx and elevated him to a quasi-sacred figure. Stalin came into contact with Marxist circles in Tbilisi in 1893 and was recruited by the Tsarist secret service, the Okhrana. So, the Tsars were from the German aristocratic families of Hessen and Schleswig-Holstein. They did not have full control over the Russian Empire, but instead had to share power with the older regular aristocracy. Various ideas were considered to modernize the Russian system, like converting it into a constitutional monarchy or a republic, but all these attempts were vetoed by the normal aristocracy. Another idea was to retain the monarchy and reorganize everything below as a socialist control system. In his book, The Young Stalin, former CIA agent and historian Edward Ellis Smith voiced his surprise about how lackluster the efforts were by the Tsarist secret police to slow the growth of socialist movements. The infiltration was thorough enough to be able to shut down illegal printing presses and networks, but for some reason, socialism was allowed to grow. If the Tsars and their British relatives had intended to oust the regular Russian aristocracy, this behavior makes sense. Rile up the Russian farmers, preach liberation from the old system of serfdom, and have a controlled revolution while keeping the Tsarist throne intact. Of interest is a group of influential men from the British elite University of Oxford and the Secret Service SIS or MI6. The Russian nobleman Felix Yusupov, who married into the Romanov clan, was accepted into the Bullingdon Club student organization during his time at Oxford. And Bullingdon is where British kings, nobles, future political stars and businessmen rubbed their shoulders. Mr. Yusupov took part in the plot to kill Rasputin, who had used his considerable influence to stir up sentiment against Russia's involvement in the First World War. If Russia had withdrawn from the war, the Germans would no longer have been in the grip of a two-front war and could have deployed virtually all their troops against Britain, France, and the United States. The Briton Samuel Hoare, 1st Viscount Templewood, had also been in the Bullingdon Club in Oxford. He learned Russian as a military officer and was recruited by the Secret Service chief Mansfield Cumming from the SIS or MI6 to maintain connections with the Russian Secret Service in St. Petersburg. Mr. Hoare's career later extended into the Second World War. Captain Stephen Alley, an SIS MI6 agent who was most likely involved in the assassination attempt on Rasputin, was raised in a Yusupov family home. The SIS MI6 agent John Scale served in the propaganda department called Anglo-Russian Commission in St. Petersburg, which was also involved in British supplies for the Russian military. Oswald Rayner studied at Oxford, became friends with Yusupov there, and eventually joined the SIS. Rayner was said to be the only man with a gun at the scene of Rasputin's murder. Another acquaintance of Yusupov was the Briton Albert Stopford, who had connections to Queen Victoria, King Edward VII, and King George V. Stopford spied for the British War Office. During World War I, the Russian forces and supplies were drained enough to set the stage for the Russian Civil War. The so-called Whites had previously lost so many men and arms that they were soon outnumbered and outgunned by the Reds. Now, of course, the Whites represented the regular old aristocracy in Russia. So those are the people, the czars, those were the people which the czars tried to get rid of for quite some time. The Tsarist family was taken to Yekaterinburg in the Ural mountain area. The British throne openly announced that it would bring in the closely related czars, but then decided against it. The most obvious thing would have been to fake the death of the czar, take the czar's family out of Russia and hide them in Denmark, for example, where relatives also sat on the throne. According to the usual history, the standard historical view, the members of the Tsar's family were murdered on the night of July 16th to July 17th, 1918, by a commando group from the Soviet State Security Service, the Cheka, in the basement of the Ipatiev house near Yekaterinburg. The bodies were taken away or burned, and the remains of the bones were partly dissolved in acid. According to legend, the Tsar's family was lured into the cellar. The death sentence was briefly read out, and then the men opened fire. The bodies were hastily removed and brought out again shortly afterwards, using fire and acid and burying the remains. Why hadn't the Cheka simply used poison and blown up the bodies with dynamite? Wouldn't that have been much simpler and more professional? The alleged murderers took no photos, no films, there was no confession that the Tsar had to write or sign, no show trial, nothing. It was only many decades later, after the end of the Soviet Union, that Russian, British, and American scientists presented DNA evidence based on bone remains from a forest find, which could easily have been manipulated. A large number of members of the Romanov dynasty were confirmed to have fled abroad. So in April 1919, for example, a number of Romanov Grand Dukes left Crimea in a British naval ship. Queen Alexandra of Great Britain, from Schleswig-Holstein, Sonderburg, Glücksburg, the Royal House of Denmark, and Hessen-Kassel, was the aunt of the last Tsar. After the revolution, at Alexandra's urgent request, Maria was brought to safety from Crimea on the ship HMS Marlborough. She traveled to Denmark via England and settled in the summer residence Hvidøre near Copenhagen. Most of the information about the crime scene and witness statements were published in a book by a Mr. Sokolov. The White Army soldiers were able to occupy the Ipatiev house and collect evidence around 8 days after the alleged murder of the Tsars, but 8 days is a long time. It was only a year later that Sokolov was able to begin to systematically evaluate the material, and he was unable to find the bodies. Although 2 amateurs are said to have managed to track down the remains nearby in the year 1979. A few other Romanovs were supposedly killed, but none of the bodies could be clearly identified. So again, by modern standards of investigative techniques, if you don't have a body, a credible body, you don't really have a credible murder case. Russian, British, and American forensic experts agreed that the Romanovs' remains had been found. The DNA tests were carried out by the Russian Dr. Pavel Ivanov and Dr. Peter Gill from the Forensic Science Service in the UK. Generously, Prince Philip Mountbatten, husband of Queen Elizabeth, close relative of the Tsars, donated a blood sample for comparison. This was cross-checked by Dr. Erika Hagelberg from the University of Cambridge. But the DNA was already largely destroyed, and the remains had been in the care of the Russian state, where somebody could easily have contaminated them. In 2004, scientists from the United States criticized the results of the British Forensic Science Service and expressed the suspicion that the bone remains had been accidentally or intentionally contaminated. An old shirt of the Tsar with traces of blood that he wore during an assassination attempt in Japan is said to have suddenly appeared in a museum. According to other information, it was a scarf or a handkerchief. As if by a miracle, it was not thrown away but kept, and a DNA sample was obtained from it, it was claimed. even though the material in the blood had been exposed to sunlight and oxygen for almost 100 years. The Japanese scientist Tatsuo Nagai doubted the Russian and British test results as early as 1997, and in 1999 compared hair samples from Georgy Romanov with the gene sequence that Dr. Peter Gill presented in Great Britain. It was not a match. There was no match. Then there was an examination by Dr. Alec Knight at Stanford University, which was cross-checked by other scientists and published in the journal Annals of Human Biology. Knight criticized the use of the PCR method. DNA from bones that laid at a shallow depth underground for over 70 years in an area where it gets quite warm in the summer, then gets cold again. The DNA must have decayed to such an extent that it's difficult to find pieces longer than 250 base pairs. So if a sequence of 1,223 base pairs was detected in all 9 corpses, this could only mean a contamination of the samples. Peter de Knief, head of forensic DNA research lab at Leiden University Medical Center in Holland, agreed that the Russian and British studies were not entirely convincing. Ivanov also refused to take a look at the blood-stained handkerchief or shirt that the Tsar had allegedly used to dab a wound. Ivanov kept the details of this alleged 100-year-old blood sample to himself and claimed that after his examination, the DNA had now finally decayed. So, if we don't have a convincing DNA analysis, the supposed bodies are not convincing. And without bodies, it is not proven by modern standards that the Tsar and his family, that they were murdered. So, in any other case, if a public prosecutor wants to charge a person with murder but no body has turned up, then the prosecution has a problem. It is important to remember the magnitude of this matter. Our conventional 20th century understanding of history is based on a ridiculous DNA analysis of ancient bones that were in the care of the Russian state and were probably deliberately contaminated. If we consider at least the possibility that the Tsar's family had fled, then they would most likely have gone into hiding with relatives in Britain or Denmark. Russian authorities and the state-controlled Orthodox Church launched a ridiculous investigation in 2015 into whether the Tsars died in a Jewish satanic ritual murder. These cheesy conspiracy theories are not only intended to distract from real new investigations, but to perpetuate the age-old myth that the revolution was the work of satanic Illuminati Jews. Now remember, this idea of a Jewish world conspiracy, this idea had been pushed really hard by British intelligence, and even though the Brits themselves, the aristocratic families, they created the modern banking system, and the crown obviously controlled these so-called private merchant banks, such as Barclays and Barings and Lloyds and Rothschild and all the others. Joseph Stalin came from a humble Georgian background and tried his hand at being a communist revolutionary after his education at a church school, and was repeatedly caught and imprisoned by the police. Somehow he managed to achieve an elevated status within the important communist circles, even though he was unable to contribute anything special. He was not a good speaker, not a good writer, or theorist. He had no military skills and no money. He was not present at important events, just somewhere else or in prison. Many of his comrades distrusted him. But somehow he remained surprisingly relevant, and after the revolution, found himself in a position to continually expand his position until he achieved totalitarian rule. So a nobody from nowhere made it to the top. Stalin had been arrested so often that it would have been extremely easy for the authorities to recruit him as an informant, and moreover, he regularly traveled thousands of kilometers through several checkpoints without clean papers as a wanted man. Nothing could harm him, not even escaping through ice and snow over hundreds of miles. Edward Smith's 1967 book, The Young Stalin, The Early Years of an Elusive Revolutionary, remains the most serious study of Stalin's possible spy activities, and Mr. Smith himself had worked as a CIA agent. Even the Harvard historian Robert C. Tucker writes that the socialist groups initially planned to build socialism under Tsarist rule and disempower only the ordinary Russian nobility. The plan was later modified so that in the future there would be a committee of socialists at the head of the state. It would have been a great thing for the Romanovs to use their secret services to build a massive socialist underground movement and then use this to disempower the ordinary nobility. Stalin's life up to the 1917-1918 revolution was retroactively romanticized by the Soviet state and stylized as the heroic story of a true revolutionary. But viewed soberly, it is very nebulous and was further clouded by false information and a reserve that was unusual. He was completely silent about his family members and many, many other things. On April 5th, 1902, Stalin was arrested for the first time by the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police. If he had already been a spy, the arrest would have strengthened his badly damaged credibility in left-wing circles. If he wasn't a spy before, it would have been the opportunity to recruit him as a spy. Without a proper trial, he was sentenced to a lenient prison sentence and exile, although he was able to use this entire time undisturbed to continue managing left-wing networks from prison. The famous Trotsky later wondered why the Okhrana handled Stalin's case without the usual prosecutional and court procedures, and why all the files on his arrests were not published. There are different and contradictory statements about the time when he fled Siberia and returned, as well as the nebulous circumstances. Despite suffering from tuberculosis, he marched supposedly through the freezing cold and was then looked after by people in a forest hut, and then traveled thousands of miles home as a wanted man without being picked up at the 29 police checkpoints on the railway network. And it is quite likely that Stalin was not actually in Siberia. Why should he even return to Batumi and Tbilisi, where the socialists suspected him and where he was known to the police? His activities in 1904 and 1905 are very, very nebulous. And he was arrested a second time. Somehow he was able to escape again and take part in the Bolshevik conference abroad where he met Lenin. Lenin considered the Okhrana agent Jacob Szytomilski, he considered him a friend and a great revolutionary. So it's confirmed that many important Bolsheviks were spies. Spies, basically, for the Tsar. Stalin escaped again and again and again. In 1911, the police are said to have stopped hunting for him because the terms of his exile sentence would have expired anyway. But then there was another arrest. The confirmed Okhrana spy Roman Malinovsky, Lenin's closest confidant, was also regularly arrested by the police to bolster his reputation. He seemed to encourage Lenin to appoint Stalin, of all people, as a member of the inner party circle, the Central Committee. Communists such as Boris Nikolaevsky suspected Stalin, so everybody kind of knew he was strange. Stalin ended up in exile again, where he remained until the outbreak of the October Revolution in 1917. Almost every revolutionary who had anything to do with him hated him, or at least distrusted him. He was not a gifted speaker or writer, he had no military experience, and he took no visible leadership role in the crucial weeks and months of the revolution. Nevertheless, Lenin gave him a position in the leadership of the Bolsheviks. The last Tsar disappeared and the Tsar's secret service was officially over. However, the staff and the files and the networks, they did not disappear into thin air. For the author Edward Ellis Smith, the American intelligence expert, the picture that emerges in the book, The Young Stalin, is that Stalin was lucky enough not to be exposed, and in the following decades he tried diligently to destroy files, and he tried to falsify his own history. As a dictator, he gradually destroyed almost all of his old Bolshevik comrades. Edward Smith explains that Stalin's rule was comparable to that of a Tsar. It is almost as if the Okhrana had finally belatedly won over the Bolsheviks. These are basically the words of Mr. Smith, the intelligence expert. A few pages earlier, Smith speculates that at the time of the revolution, parts of the Okhrana intelligence organization went underground and collaborated with Stalin in some form. Since Stalin was not the only Okhrana agent in the new Soviet system, and since the Okhrana most likely had a direct line to British intelligence, we have to ask what the British intentions were. Did the British mess up again, and did they try to cover this up in order to stay relevant? So who infiltrated whom? Did this all spiral out of control, as it happened so many times? Of course, British intelligence was up to its old tricks by spreading the fake protocols of Zion, which painted the communist revolution as the work of satanic Jews. Trotsky had previously been in New York, and he got his hands on $10,000 there. Olof Aschberg, founder and majority owner of the Swedish cooperative bank AB Banken, diligently helped finance the communist revolution. He had excellent relations with the last finance minister of the Russian Empire, Pyotr Lvovich Bark, also known as Peter Bark, who, with the help of, among others, Great Britain and the United States, had financed Russia's military activities against Germany in the First World War. Mr. Bark fled to London to a luxury villa, changed his first name to Peter, and was promptly hired by Barings Bank, which goes back to the Baring family from Hanover, Welfen territory, of course. On behalf of the Bank of England, he was paid out an amount of £16,500. To this day, historians cannot explain this. The Baring family originally came from Hanover and belonged to a privileged class there that enjoyed the trust of nobility. Peter Bark became an advisor to the Bank of England and earned the Royal Victorian Order and the title of Baronet. This baffled many in the banking sphere because he had no formal experience with the Bank of England. Before he fled to London, he was in Paris and was under surveillance by the French Secret Service. In a dossier from January 25th, 1919, in the dossier, it is stated that Bark was a Bolshevik agent who had been in contact with Leon Trotsky since 1917 and was said to have continued contact after the establishment of the Soviet regime. At the same time, Bark was a loyal supporter of the Romanov refugees in England, Denmark, and elsewhere. The Romanovs were basically one and the same family as the British throne and same family as Denmark. For example, through King George V, with whom he was already in close contact during the war, Bark provided the Tsar's sister, Grand Duchess Xenia, with Frogmore Cottage as a new home. After the death of Maria Fyodorovna, Bark brought jewelry worth £200,000, so today it would be like 6 million euros, from Copenhagen to London on behalf of Xenia and her sister Olga. So the Romanovs, the British throne, and to a lesser extent Peter Bark knew where the last Tsar's vast fortune had gone. Now, many myths have sprung up about this, so it's not like some people believe, that there's just mountains of gold stashed somewhere, or just cash parked at some at certain accounts. Quite a bit of the money was used up in World War I against the Germans, and some of the money then played a role in the Russian Civil War. And a substantial amount of the Tsar's wealth, a substantial amount was immobile. It was land, it was certain mines, so this is not something you can just pick up and move, let's say, to the city of London. But of course there was gold, and of course there was cash, and there was also stock. They also owned quite a bit of stock. The private accounts at the Bank of England are said to have been closed during First World War and balances transferred back to Russia. Russia traditionally conducted all foreign business through the City of London and had several accounts at the Bank of England. The authorized representative and trustee of these accounts was Mr. Peter Bark. Agents of the aristocracy helped to quickly rebuild the economy of Soviet Russia. In 1917 and 1918, the American prosecutor and later judge Thomas D. Thatcher was in charge of the Russian mission of the American Red Cross, whose chairman was William Howard Taft, who had previously served as a United States president. The Red Cross was a charity, but at the same time a vehicle for secret foreign policy. The Red Cross mission included Frederick Coors from the branch of the National City Bank in Petrograd. Both Thatcher and Taft were members of the secret organization Skull and Bones, which dates back to the British colonial empire, the nobility, and secret British networks. So again, the British had infiltrated the United States, heavily infiltrated the United States after the Revolution, and build up these clandestine networks. And so if the British were too close to the Russians, if the British had somehow messed up, if the British were entangled with the Russians and then the Soviet Russians, then also these older networks, these older spy networks in the United States would then be compromised, and this may be the secret of the KGB's success. The success of Soviet Russian intelligence. Over time, Lenin and his comrades had formally become the rulers of Russian territory, but industry was virtually at a standstill, meaning the new socialist state had no significant revenue and limited diplomatic recognition from foreign countries. Where should new equipment be purchased to produce oil and manganese and on a significant scale again? A number of Americans came to the rescue, based in the Equitable Building at 120 Broadway in New York's financial district. Over time, the brand new high-rise had housed top corporations such as General Electric, DuPont, Aluminum Company of New York, railroad companies, and others. Tenants like Barclays and the New York branch of the Federal Reserve. So they delivered exactly what the Soviets desperately needed. The key to Russian reconstruction was the Caucasus oil fields in Baku. American companies like the International Barnstable Corporation sold the necessary equipment and even bought oil from the Soviets. Between 1898 and 1903, British oil companies invested 60 million rubles in the oil fields of Baku. Between 1898 and 1901, Baku produced more oil than the United States. By 1901, half of the world's oil was produced from wells located within 6 square miles. On the eve of World War I, 3 companies, Russian General Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and a partnership of the Nobel brothers, held 86% of the total share capital and controlled 60% of oil production. In 1912, Anglo-Dutch Shell acquired 80% of the shares in the Caspian Black Sea Society Mazout, which had belonged to the Rothschild brothers, the French branch. The Soviets also acquired modern mining and transportation facilities for their manganese deposits, acquired foreign currency, and circumvented official American foreign policy regarding loans to the USSR in a series of business arrangements with the W.A. Harriman Company and the Guarantee Trust. In 1925, an agreement was reached between the Harriman Company of New York and the USSR. They concluded a concession agreement for the exploitation of the Chiaturi manganese deposits and the comprehensive introduction of modern mining and transport methods. So again and again, we come across members of the secret organization Skull and Bones, which goes back to British networks. The chairman of the Georgian Manganese Company was Bones member C. Brush. The Harriman Syndicate did not inform the U.S. State Department of its plans. Averill Harriman had essentially smuggled an illegal project past the U.S. government. The law firm of Simpson, Thatcher, and Bartlett was located in 120 Broadway in New York in the 1920s and helped the interests of the Soviet Union. The law firm was founded by Thomas Thatcher, Skull and Bones member. His son was a Bones member, and so on and so forth. Thatcher became friends with Felix Frankfurter and Raymond Robbins. According to the extensive documentation in the Lusk Committee files, both Mr. Frankfurter and Robbins were of considerable assistance to the Soviets. Frankfurter, who later became a Supreme Court justice, led a meeting in November 1919 to advocate for American recognition of the newly created Soviet Union. The Russo-British Chamber of Commerce still advertises on its website that it has been the bridge for business between Britain and Russia since 1916. The Anglo-Soviet Trade Agreement was an agreement signed in 1921 to facilitate trade between the United Kingdom and the Russian Soviet Empire. It was signed by Robert Horne, the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Leonid Krasin, the Russian Commissioner for Foreign Trade. Robert Stevenson Horne, the first Viscount Horne of Slaminen, sat on the Privy Council, and he was also King's Counsel. So, it seems as if the British aristocracy was the secret of the success of the communist movement. And this problem persists to this very day. And especially today, Russia has rebranded itself as conservative. So by being a supporter of Russia, you no longer have to be a communist. And this, of course, makes it much harder for people in the West, especially the United States, to understand the scope of this problem.